I stood in the wings of the grand ballroom, the heavy velvet curtain the only thing separating me from 1,000 people who thought my husband was a saint. I watched through a tiny slit as Julian stood center stage, bathed in a golden spotlight, his voice cracking with a manufactured emotion that I used to find beautiful. He was holding an award for Humanitarian of the Year, and he was currently telling the crowd that his wife, me, was the heartbeat behind his kindness. He called me his silent angel, his moral compass, and the reason he dedicated his life to saving the underprivileged. The audience was in tears. The cameras were rolling for a live global stream, but in my hand, I held a tablet connected to the ballroom's massive projection screen. On that tablet was a folder containing every wire transfer Julian had made from the charity's emergency fund directly to a private developer in Dubai for a penthouse that was currently registered in his mistress's name. Julian thought tonight was the pinnacle of his career, the night he would secure $10 million in new donations. He had no idea that in exactly 60 seconds, I wasn't going to be his silent angel anymore. I was going to be the storm that leveled his entire world. I looked at the broadcast button, my finger hovering over the glass, and I whispered to myself, let's give them a show they actually paid for. 5 years ago, Julian was a struggling activist with big dreams and an empty bank account. I was a senior financial auditor with a reputation for being unbreakable and a family inheritance that I wanted to use for good. When we met, it felt like the universe had finally made a match that mattered. He didn't want a trophy wife. He wanted a partner. He convinced me that my financial brain and his public charisma could change the world. We founded the Open Heart Initiative together. Our wedding wasn't a celebrity circus. It was a small, elegant ceremony where we asked guests to donate to our foundation instead of buying us gifts. I loved him with a purity that blinded me. I gave him my career, my connections, and eventually, the full control of my family's trust to kickstart our mission. For the first 3 years, it was a fairy tale. We were the darlings of the philanthropic world. We traveled to remote villages, built schools, and provided clean water to thousands. Julian was the face, the man who could talk anyone into writing a check. I was the strategist, the one who made sure the money went exactly where it was supposed to. We lived in a modest apartment despite our success, because Julian insisted that every dollar we spend on luxury is a dollar taken from a child in need. I admired his discipline. I adored his selflessness. We spent our evenings planning for the future, talking about the legacy we would leave behind. He would hold me and tell me that I was the only person who truly knew his soul. I believed him. I believed him so much that when he suggested he take over the public relations and branding aspect of my image, I agreed. He told me he wanted to protect me from the toxicity of the internet. In reality, he was erasing my presence so that the world would only ever see him as the sole hero of the story. The rot started slowly. So slowly that I almost missed it. About 18 months ago, Julian's fundraising trips started getting longer. He said he was meeting with high-net-worth individuals in London, Paris, and Dubai. He started dressing in bespoke suits that cost more than a village school, claiming that, to get money from the rich, you have to look like the rich. Then came the new assistant, a woman named Chloe. She was young, brilliant at social media, and always by Julian's side. Julian told me her salary was being paid by a private donor who wanted to remain anonymous. I didn't question it. Why would I? We were doing God's work. But then, the financial abuse began. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was quiet and manipulative. Julian started asking me to simplify our household expenses. He told me that my personal spending was distracting from the foundation's image. He moved our joint savings into a foundation management account for tax purposes and gave me a stipend. Suddenly, the woman who had audited multi-million-dollar firms had to ask her husband for permission to buy a new pair of shoes. The red flags became impossible to ignore 6 months ago. Julian was in Dubai for a gala, and I stayed behind to finalize the year-end audit. I noticed a series of irregular payments labeled logistics and transport. They were large, 6 figures, and they were being routed through a shell company I didn't recognize. When I called Julian to ask about it, he didn't sound like the kind man I married. He sounded annoyed, his voice sharp and cold. Clara, you're overthinking again. It's a specialized medical shipment for the Yemen project. The paperwork is sensitive. Just sign the release and stop acting like a suspicious bookkeeper. You're embarrassing me. It was the first time he had ever spoken to me with such contempt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I decided to do what I did best. I started following the money. The discovery was a slow, agonizing process. Since Julian had blocked my access to the main servers, I had to use my old forensic tools to bypass the security. It took me 3 weeks of working in the middle of the night, while Julian was snoring beside me, to find the truth. I found a hidden set of ledgers. Julian wasn't just skimming off the top, he was gutting the foundation. He had created a sophisticated charity-to-mistress pipeline. Chloe wasn't just an assistant, she was his partner in crime. The anonymous donor paying her salary was actually our foundation's emergency fund. The shell company, Logistics and Transport, was paying for a luxury lifestyle I never knew existed. I found photos in a hidden cloud folder, Julian and Chloe on private jets, Chloe wearing diamonds that could have funded 10 hospitals, and a deed for a $5 million penthouse in Dubai. The most painful part wasn't the cheating. It was the audacity. In one recorded voice memo I found, Julian was laughing with Chloe about me. He called me his useful idiot. He said, "Clara is so obsessed with her good deeds that she doesn't even notice I'm spending her grandfather's money to buy you a walk-in closet. She thinks we're saving the world, but we're just saving ourselves for a very early retirement." Hearing those words broke something inside me that can never be mended. I realized that the man I loved never existed. He was a character created to lure in a woman with resources. I wasn't his partner. I was his mark. I sat in our dark living room, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my eyes, and I realized that if I confronted him now, he would use his massive PR machine to crush me. He would tell the world I was a bitter, jealous wife trying to ruin a saint. He had spent years building a shield of public adoration, and I was just a ghost in the background. But ghosts have one advantage. We see everything, and we are never suspected. I realized that the only way to stop a man who lives for the spotlight is to use that very spotlight to burn him. I decided to wait. I waited for the most important night of his life, the World Heart Gala. This was the event where Julian planned to announce a new global children's fund and collect millions in live donations. He had spent months preparing for this. He wanted the world to see him as the ultimate savior. I spent those same months preparing my own presentation. I didn't just gather bank statements. I gathered every text message, every photo of him with Chloe, and every receipt for the stolen funds. I created a video, not the emotional tribute to the charity that Julian expected, but a documentary of his betrayal. Tonight, the ballroom is filled with the world's elite. The champagne is flowing, the diamonds are glittering, and Julian is at the podium, giving the performance of a lifetime. He just finished a segment about transparency and trust. He looks so proud of himself. Chloe is sitting in the front row, wearing a dress that costs more than my car, blowing him a secret kiss. They think they've won. They think the useful idiot is sitting at home, watching the stream with tears of pride in her eyes. They don't know that I'm standing 20 feet away. And the technician in the booth, a man whose sister's life was saved by a real charity, and who was horrified by what I showed him, is waiting for my signal. Julian is wrapping up his speech now. "And now," he says, his voice booming with fake sincerity, "please turn your attention to the screen for a look at the lives we've changed this year. This is the heart of why we do what we do." The lights in the ballroom dim. The massive screen behind him glows white. This is the moment. My heart is racing, but my hand is steady. I look at Julian's silhouette against the screen, the man who tried to erase my mind and steal my soul, and I press the button. The first thing that appears on the screen isn't a starving child or a new school. It's a high-definition photo of Julian and Chloe on a yacht in Ibiza, with a caption in bold letters, "This is where your donations actually went." The gasp from the audience is a sound I will never forget. Julian turns around, his face illuminated by the proof of his own lies. He freezes. The humanitarian of the year looks like a deer caught in the headlights of a freight train. The audio begins to play. His own voice, clear and cold, calling his donors gullible fools and me a useful idiot. The trap hasn't just been sprung, it's closing in. And I haven't even shown them the bank transfers yet. The sound of 1,000 people gasping in unison is something you can't describe. It's a physical weight, a collective realization that the ground everyone was standing on was actually a trapdoor. Julian stood paralyzed, his shadow cast long and distorted against the giant screen that was now scrolling through his private bank statements. The Humanitarian of the Year award was still clutched in his hand, but it looked ridiculous now, like a toy in the hands of a thief. I stepped out from the shadows of the curtain and walked slowly toward the center of the stage. The clicking of my heels on the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room. I didn't look at the audience. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked directly at the man I had once called my soulmate. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But before he could utter a single lie, I leaned into the microphone. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My voice was as calm and cold as a winter morning. The audit is complete, Julian, I said. And you are officially bankrupt. The next 60 seconds were a masterclass in chaos. Chloe, realizing that the ship was sinking in real time, tried to slip out of the front row, but the donors she had spent months charming weren't about to let her go. A group of security guards, whom I had personally briefed and paid for with my own remaining funds earlier that day, blocked the exits. On the screen, the documentary of their betrayal continued to play. I showed the world the receipts for the Dubai penthouse. I showed them the flight logs of the private jets. But the final blow was the Yemen project footage. Julian had told the donors that we were shipping life-saving medicine. The screen showed the actual warehouse, empty, dusty, and abandoned, with a voiceover of Julian's local contact explaining that the shipping fees were actually being kicked back into Julian's offshore account. The crowd erupted. It wasn't just anger. It was a riot of betrayed trust. People who had given millions to help children realized they had been funding a sociopath's vacation. Julian finally found his voice. But it wasn't the voice of the saint the world knew. It was the snarling, desperate voice of the predator I had discovered in those hidden ledgers. "This is a fabrication," he roared, turning to the crowd, his hands shaking as he pointed at me. "She's a scorned wife. She's mentally unstable. She hacked the system to frame me because I asked for a divorce. Don't believe a word this woman says." He was leaning into the old script, the one where the woman is always crazy and the man is always the victim of her emotions. For a second, the room wavered. People looked at me, then at him, the habit of believing a charismatic man over a quiet woman still lingering in the air. I smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a remote. "I expected you to say that, Julian. Which is why I didn't just bring photos. I brought the architect of your offshore accounts." The back doors of the ballroom opened, and 2 federal agents walked in, escorting a man in a gray suit. It was Julian's private accountant, the man he thought he had bought with a house in the Maldives. What Julian didn't know was that I had spent the last 3 weeks showing that accountant the paper trail that led directly to him being the fall guy for Julian's fraud. Faced with 20 years in prison or testifying against Julian, the choice was easy for him. The accountant stepped onto the stage, took the microphone, and said 5 words that ended Julian's life. Everything she said is true. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian dropped the award. The heavy glass trophy shattered on the stage, a perfect metaphor for his reputation. The federal agents stepped forward, and in front of a live global audience, the Humanitarian of the Year was placed in handcuffs. As they led him away, Julian turned to me, his eyes burning with a hatred so intense it should have scorched me. "I gave you everything," he hissed. "You were nothing before me." I stood my ground, my head held high, and looked him in the eye. "No, Julian," I whispered, so only he could hear. "I was the foundation. You were just the peeling paint on the walls. Without me, you're just a convict in a cheap suit." I watched them drag him out of the light and into the back of a police cruiser. Chloe was taken out through the side exit, her designer dress torn in the scuffle, her face hidden behind her hands. The power couple was gone. The Open Heart Initiative was dead, and I was left standing in the wreckage of a 5-year lie. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal battles and public scrutiny. Julian's legal team tried everything. They tried to claim the evidence was obtained illegally. They tried to smear my name in the tabloids, calling me a tech terrorist and a vengeful ex. But they couldn't fight the numbers. Mathematics doesn't have emotions, and the numbers proved that Julian had stolen over $15 million from the world's most vulnerable people. I didn't hide. I didn't go into a shell. I sat through every deposition, I answered every reporter's question, and I made sure that every single dollar Julian had hidden was frozen and returned to the foundation. But I didn't stop there. I knew that the Open Heart Initiative was too tainted by Julian's name to survive. So I dissolved it. I used my legal power as the co-founder to shut it down and transfer the remaining assets to 3 legitimate, verified charities that I knew were actually doing the work. I lost my husband. I lost the home I thought was a sanctuary. I even lost a significant portion of my own inheritance to the legal fees and the debt Julian had racked up in my name. To many, it looked like I had lost everything. But as I sat in my new small apartment in the city, looking out at the skyline, I realized I had actually gained the one thing I had been missing for 5 years: myself. I had spent so much time being the silent angel, the supporting wife, and the ghost in the background that I had forgotten I was a powerhouse in my own right. I had forgotten that I was the one who could solve the problems Julian couldn't even understand. I had let a man convince me that my value was tied to his success, and that was the biggest lie of all. I went back to work. I didn't go back as a consultant for someone else. I started my own firm, an investigative tech agency that specializes in tracking charity fraud and financial abuse. I used my experience as a weapon. I became the person I needed when I was sitting in that dark living room, staring at Julian's bank statements. My firm became the nightmare of every charismatic predator who thinks they can use a woman's resources to build their empire. I called the firm the Foundation because I wanted every woman who walked through my door to know that she is the bedrock of her own life, and no man has the right to build his house on her without her permission. The lesson I want every girl, every woman, and every person listening to this to take away is simple but vital. Never let anyone handle your vision for you. We are taught that teamwork in a marriage means handing over the keys to our finances, our dreams, and our identities to a partner who claims they want to protect us. But protection shouldn't feel like a cage. Love shouldn't feel like a fog. If your partner tells you that you're too emotional to understand the finances, or that your privacy is more important than your presence, they are not shielding you. They are erasing you. They are building a pedestal for themselves using your bricks. And the moment they reach the top, they will forget who provided the labor. Julian thought I was a useful idiot. He thought my kindness was a weakness he could exploit forever. He didn't realize that kindness, when betrayed, turns into a fierce, calculating justice. He didn't realize that the silent angel was actually the one holding the sword. Today, Julian is serving 12 years in a federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. Chloe disappeared into the shadows, her reputation so destroyed she can't even get a job as a receptionist. And me? I am the most successful I have ever been. Not because I have the most money, but because I have the most peace. I wake up every morning knowing exactly who I am, exactly what I own, and exactly where my money is going. I am no longer a ghost. I am the architect of my own destiny. The road to recovery wasn't easy. There were nights when I missed the lie. There were nights when I wanted to go back to the fairy tale, even knowing it was poisoned. But then I would look at the photos of the schools that were never built, and the children who never got their medicine because of Julian's greed, and my heart would harden into diamonds. We owe it to ourselves to be our own heroes. We owe it to ourselves to trust our gut, even when the world tells us we're being, quote, paranoid. Your intuition is the most powerful software you own. Don't ever let a man tell you it's a glitch. I didn't just survive Julian's betrayal, I used it as the fuel to launch a life that is actually mine. I am no longer defined by the man I stand behind. I am defined by the work I do, the people I help, and the truth I tell. Julian wanted a trophy. He got a revolution. He wanted a silent partner. He got a public execution of his character. And to every woman out there who feels like she is losing her grip, like she is being gaslit into believing she isn't enough, look at me.